Well, where do we start? Well, I was going to ask you this earlier, and then I said I'd wait to do this now.
Sure.
When you come in here and you see this new series of work with some examples of your previous work, does that tie together in your mind? Do you see a logical or some sort of progression? Or are they really discrete, independent?
I mean, it seems to me every time I see, my previous work in relationship with the new work, it's like, in a way, I'm going to make an analogy here, but in the sense that when you see an old family album, an old picture that you were part of, but in a way it became part of your subconscious memory. So in a sense, when I see that work, obviously I did it myself, and I remember specific moments and how some areas were done, but it became almost like a really vague memory. So what I really think is happening, the connection might be an emotional connection more than anything else, more than physical in that regard. Obviously I'm using the same materials and so on, but I think what is really intriguing to me is that when you are so involved in making the work and so attached to it, when you are done with it, it's no longer your current memory and become part of your history. So it's like you see, to me that's the connection is that I did it and I was in the moment, I was in the zone, but I don't know if I remember how that was done
Or how
I got to that point. So, but one thing that is important to me to think about, and one of the things that I think the work attaches, the link or the core is that emotional disclosure that I have when it comes to my studio practice. I mean, every time I make work, I'm totally exposed myself. When I have a show like this, I'm totally vulnerable. And I think at that level is like really, that's the connection that I see, more than technically, is that kind of that conceptually speaking notion.
Is there any link between the printmaking and the drawings? Is there a link? I know when we talked before, you talked about there's some technique that is, to some measure, you're bringing printmaking to drawing.
Right. I think there is, there's certainly a technical association, because now the way that I'm approaching my drawings is additive and it's subtractive at the same time. So I add things to it, I add graphite to it, but there's also a sense that I'm subtractive. So I'm using erasures as a way of using mark making instead of making corrections. So that's totally a printmaking related kind of train of thought. But I think the connection, the deeper connection, or the fundamental connection that I think it is important to mention, is that printmaking allowed me for the first 10 years of my career to really come, sit down and think about my work, because I do know, making a print takes forever to make, and I kind of that in a way taking 3, 4, 5 months to make a print allowed me back in the days to really think about my work and my intention and my really to understand the core of my work. So I think the connection is a fundamental one, because that printmaking allowed me to really think about what my work was about. So now I can change media with no problem, as you can see. I can go from drawing to painting, because in a way, I'm thinking about my work in a more holistic way, more than just being, totally, claustrophobic in one, media.
And as you do this, you said, when we talked again before, you talked about a phrase or whatever that triggered you to make a series of work. When did that start early on? Or
no,
that came much later?
Just came right after. I think, part of my reason that I got somewhat frustrated with printmaking, besides the injury and so on, is that sense that, when you're making a print, and once again, there's nothing wrong with making a print, and I love it. That printmaking for me is like my mother tongue. I will always speak it, I will never forget it, but now I'm enamored with other languages in a way. So I think that fundamental principle to me is really important. But I think once you get to the point that you work for 3 or 4 months in a print, you kind of know what to expect. So that became almost a frustration. That predictability became kind of, I wouldn't say boring because I don't use that in my vocabulary, but I think it became somewhat not challenging anymore. So I think pre-making, the injury and the predictability of it didn't challenge my emotions anymore. And I think kind of every time I make a new work, obviously there's an emotional distress that happens in the early stages, as you say, when you start coming up with a phrase or an idea. But more than anything, it's a technical challenge, because in order to be engaged for 14, 15 hours a day, you have to be challenged by the technicality of it. Because working for, like as I say, for 14 hours in an inch and a half, it takes more than just being enamored. It takes an emotional kind of challenge to get that done. So in a way, it's a technical challenge, but also it's an emotional exposure in a way. I know if I'm making myself clear.
Oh, sure. So, take an example. What's the challenge of the one with the cows in it? I can tell you this, I never expected to see cows.
Well, listen, right. I mean, you asked me, this a year ago, I would have been scared. I would be like, I don't think I would never do cows. But once again, I think as we talked earlier on, I think the notion of, so I think a lot about my work, as you probably know. I'm always constantly thinking about the conceptual issues that I'm thinking with, all these different, stratas of, dimensionality about the concept and so on. But once I enter my studio, that's no longer an issue. I try to leave all my baggage right, after I close the door of my studio. So when I'm in the studio, things happen. And that, as I said, that kind of honesty and that emotional disclosure allows me to make cows, allows me to make trucks that I would be totally flabbergasted by, a few years ago. But I think once again, the honesty to me is what drives me in the studio, and that's what gets me excited to be, spend so much time in the way. I know you can't answer the question, but one of the challenges, let's say, for that particular cow, I want those cows to feel like a cow. I don't want that to be an illustration of a cow. And that's always been the risk when I'm making drawings. Like, you can always make a cow that looks like cow, but you want to make a drawing that feels like cow. And that small distinction might take just that little bit of a pencil graphite to do it. But I think I'm intrigued about that, And I think, not to be an arrogant by any means, but I think I capture the feeling of what the feels of cows feels like, more than just like, obviously I can draw a cow any way I want it, but if I want to make the cow and it be out of focus to get the feeling of it without showing all the details, I will take that freedom to do it.
So you're not an illustrator.
I am not.
In any fashion.
In any form, by any means. But on top of that, I do have a good technique, and I think this might sound funny, but it's not easy to get to have a good technique. Sometimes it gets in the way, because when people see my work, oh, it looks like a photograph, oh, how spectacular. Yeah, it's fine, and I have a good technique, but sometimes it becomes an issue. How can you break that first connection, that hook? That is, I want to show off my technique, I want to impress people by it, but in a way that becomes a hook as well. So it's a kind of really a really nice balance between to hook the viewer any way you can, but then don't let them linger only the technicality aspect of the work, and then allow them to kind of come in and have that dialogue. Yeah.
So, speaking of the technique, talk a little bit about the use of the varnish and the layers, and that's going to hook people right in.
Right.
There's something about the finished product that isn't photographic.
I think in many levels, I think like that, the hook that I mentioned about, to me, is almost like more like a mystery. I want to get a mystery in the piece that eventually allow people to have a conversation with. So the way I got into that kind of drawing, all my drawings are graphite on this particular body work, and I was fixing that. You have to put a fixative to avoid the graphite traveling and moving around and smudging and so on. So I was doing that, and then at some point, because I was thinking about the things, the spray fixative got in one spot for a little too long, and then it started to shine. And at that point, that became almost like an epiphany, a revelatory moment. It's like, well, what if I started doing that in layers, because what happens is the graphite, as you all know, is a lubricant. So you're making a drawing, you get really dark, but it gets to a certain degree of darkness, it doesn't get any deeper than that, because it's really polished. So, but when you start doing, that graphite layer first, and then, varnish over it, and then graphite over it, and varnish, so you create a physical dimensionality that eventually in a single, layer of graphite will never do. And I think that becomes a different kind of challenge, and they became, so we're at this point we're thinking about maybe a 1/16 of an inch max, but emotionally and physically, it's a world apart.
Por el camino del desierto, el viento me despeina, su aroma de colita, nada del aire. Ella de lo lejos, una luz en tela, la idea de mezclar. Te vi por en la noche, ella estaba a la entrada y la campana ya sonar. Y me dijo ya mismo, esto puedo del cielo. Ella enciende una vela y nuestra de camino. Soy moza el corredor y yo te dije diciendo: he venido del California, such a lovely place, such a lovely place. Me he venido del California, such a lovely place, such a lovely place. Ella dorado que brillaba, tiene una Mercedes, rodea chico guapo, ella llama a mi amigo, cuando va en el patio